Mandell has spent half of his life working for the Capital Area Architectural and Planning Board and will be retiring from his role as Executive Secretary at the end of June. I spoke with him this week about his years of service to the state. You've spent nearly 34 years working for the Capital Area Architectural and Planning Board. What initially drew you to this kind of work?
Well, first of all, it was a planning job. I was doing some community organizing, and my college and graduate degree were both in city planning. And so that was the first tug. And then just having grown up out east and worked in DC for the feds, the fact that I was going to be able to work here at the Capitol in such a beautiful setting at the seat of government was just something I was just like. In fact, to get the job, I came in and met with the then exec sec about 5 times just to try to convince him to hire me.
So it's been a long time. You're preparing to retire, and you have had a hand in more projects than I can name. Buildings like the Minnesota History Center, memorials like Vietnam and women's suffrage, the restoration of the Minnesota State Capitol, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, the light rail line through the Capitol complex. Which of these multitude of projects has been most meaningful to you?
Well, there's no denying that the Capitol restoration was such a legacy project and such a historic project and such a, just because of the enormity of it, the time involved, and then working with all the different artisans, that was something that, it drove my decisions to not retire earlier for several years. And then when I got the executive secretary position, that drove it further down the timeline. But I have to say that the ones that were most meaningful was working with the memorial projects, when I'd be working intimately for several years at a time with Minnesota citizens, be it the Hmong or the Korean veterans or the Vietnam veterans, who had such a passion. And we were working on intimate details through the design competition, through the design evolution, and getting to know those individuals and seeing the passion they had and seeing the celebration that they had on completing it is the thing that touched my heart the most, for sure.
In your retirement letter, you spoke of this position as being intimately tied to the history and governance of the state. Can you expand on what you mean?
Well, like I said, when I was working in DC, I was working, in government, but pretty much behind the scenes. Coming here, working in this kind of a visible, highly politically charged environment, needing to work through community engagement, public engagement, developing relationships with legislators and governors and lieutenant governors and agency heads. It was, I have to believe it was a job made for me, and I could never have imagined when I was going through my graduate degree and then experiencing unemployment for the first year afterwards, that I would land such a perfect job. It was just political enough. It was, it opened me up to work in design fields and such, and working with architects and engineers and planners and designers down to the artists. I couldn't have asked for a better job to spend actually half my life, because I'm now 69 years old.
Well, it is a broad skill set that you have. You have to have diplomacy. You have to have an understanding of art and architecture and history and all of those things. And then, as you mentioned before, sort of the culmination of all of those things was the restoration and modernization of the state capitol. It's been a few years since that grand reopening. Did the renovation achieve all the goals that were desired?
I would say an emphatic yes to that. The 3 overarching principles that we had were architectural integrity, which was the Cap Board #1 charge, the effective building function of a state building so that we could bring it into the 21st century, and then life safety and accessibility. The fact that we opened up over 30,000 square feet to the public for the first time. That we had now fire controls and lighting controls and mechanical and electrical, so that we have zone heating and cooling and such. We definitely accomplished what we needed to do. I knew it was going to be more expensive. And, you know, we had our effort that we mounted in 2001 that failed. We had an effort in 2005 at the centennial of the building that never got approved. But the minute they started digging that first hole in the basement, I knew they were committed. There continues to be, of course, with an old building of marble, where water is the #1 enemy, we continue to have issues, and we will have to continue to monitor the plaster and the beautiful art paintings on the walls, because there is some delamination happening, and there is some investigation already going on as to what needs to be repaired 3 years later. And they'll have to maintain the building. They'll have to, you know, check for the caulking and the ceiling on all the dome, because those 8-foot blocks of marble move. But did we accomplish what we set out to do? Emphatically, yes. And I thank Governor Dayton and all the other leaders that had a hand in that.
The state and the country are in the midst of a conversation about how historical information is presented. We've seen it play out in the Capitol complex with the removal of the 2 paintings from the governor's reception room due to their portrayal of Indigenous people. Those paintings are now in the Cass Gilbert Library on the 3rd floor, one of the new public spaces that was created, along with interpretive panels. We've also seen the toppling of the Christopher Columbus statue. How do you view these events?
Well, we also had 2 historic paintings removed from the Capitol: the battle at Killdeer Mountain and the New Ulm. And those are in the possession of the Historical Society now. I think the Lieutenant Governor sums it up best when she says to the effect that we want to make sure that the Capitol building, the state's most public building, is a welcoming place for all its citizens, and that it tells a more inclusive history. I have my own personal preferences that I hope we elaborate on the history rather than removing pieces. But I think it's you know, our Capitol, the rotunda and a lot of those spaces was a snapshot in time. I mean, it was dedicated, you know, in many ways to the Civil War. And when the Governor Dayton had his issues with just being surrounded by Civil War art, I mean, he had a very good point that is not very inclusive. It doesn't show Minnesota today. So I don't think there's anything wrong, and working with the task forces this past 6 months has been very, very positive. They started not from scratch, but from what we had in our documents and policies, and built on that, so that we now have reinterpretation, modification, or if necessary, removal. And I would favor the 2 former ones rather than removal, unless, you know, of course, Columbus is its own case in point. That will have to be with the task force reports once they're accepted. That'll probably have to be the first task that the board still is in charge and still in the driver's seat, would have to address. But of course, he never came to Minnesota.
Right. What challenges will the next executive secretary face? I mean, I feel like you're kind of laying some of them out right now. And what advice do you have?
Well, there's always the budget issues. We are a very small board, 2 to 3 people, and we probably have, I mean, our role and the authority and the responsibilities we've been given by the legislature are far greater than a body our size should be expected to handle. And I know there's always going to be budget pressures, but with, for instance, the art subcommittee work now going on, not to mention the 17-acre Sears site, if that starts to get redeveloped, planning bodies 3 times our size can't handle a project that size. And for the 2 to 3 people that will still be here, working within a very, very tight budget where things are always increasing in cost, will depend on partnerships and a lot more cooperation, not just from the state and the city, but a lot more of a public-private partnership. But I think, you know, the budget will be an overriding issue if things get to be as busy as I expect they will be in the next decade.
Paul Mandell, it has been a pleasure getting to know you over these years. I have enjoyed your voluminous knowledge of everything that we've talked about, and I wish you all the best in your retirement.
Thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure working with you too.